particular. Murmurs. Now, you've probably all heard of murmurs, but you might not know what they are. Or if you know what they are, you might be aware of how difficult they are to identify or to, let's just say, difficult to get right. It's something that I really struggle with. I'm happy to admit that. There are a lot of things that I struggle with on my course, but murmurs is certainly one of the most difficult, and there are a great number of murmurs that all pop up in different situations, but we're going to go through some of the simple murmurs, the sorts of murmurs you'll be familiar with at my level, which is the third year of medicine at least, or perhaps going into fourth and fifth year, depending on whatever course you're on. But this is not just important for medicine, it's important for all types of healthcare degrees, nursing, midwifery. Identifying murmurs, even if it's not part of the general pathway that you're investigating, is super important. So, without further ado, let's get into it. I actually also have a glass of water here. It's quite early in the morning, and I always like to have a glass of water with my coffee to keep myself properly hydrated. So I will be switching between those. Don't think I'm a weirdo if I do that. So let's have a look at murmurs. Once again, guys, before we really get into it, if you like my notes and you want to get access to them, all of these notes will be available for you on my Patreon once this video comes out. And if you want access to those, my Patreon charges $3 a month or £2.50 a month. It's a very small amount, and you get access to all of my notes, and I have loads and loads of notes, as you can see, and I'll be uploading more every week as we go. So let's just take a look at this little graphical overview that I've pulled off the internet. It's the same one I've got as my cover photo for murmurs. So let's pull this up. This is not going to tell us very much if we don't know what murmurs are, but we can get an idea for kind of the morphology of these heart murmurs at least. So I hope I do hope, but you don't necessarily have to know what systolic and diastolic means. If you don't know, I would recommend maybe, if you're trying to learn from this video rather than just relax, I would go away and take a look at some of the heart cycle information online. There's tons of stuff out there. But in simple terms, systolic is when this is really simple terms, but systolic is when the heart is pumping and the blood is being shot into the systemic and pulmonary system from the heart, so through the pulmonary valve on the right hand side, and from the aortic, through the aorta, through the aortic valve on the left hand side into the systemic circulation. That's systole. Diastole is when that contraction relaxes and the heart begins to fill again, mostly passively, through the mitral and tricuspid valves. But there are many more stages within those two groups, systole and diastole, that you should be aware of, and it would make it a lot easier for you to understand murmurs and the positions in which murmurs sit. If you understand all those different parts of the heart cycle, we can actually take a look at the cardiac cycle at some point if you really want. I've done quite a lot on what the heart cycle is, or the cardiac cycle, whatever you want to call it. I think it's very interesting. I've got some good resources for you guys to check out if you want to. My favourite for this is actually cardiovascularphysiology.com. This is if you can see that, cvphysiology.com/whatever. That is the best way to learn vascular stuff, in my opinion. I really like that website. But let's get back into the murmurs. So, having a look at this, we can see that there are four main types of murmurs. If I can get this thing to open. can come back to you at some point and tell you that I have heard these, but for now it's just anecdotal from things like YouTube and being told things. And here are a bunch of different places that you can hear it on the left or right side, which valves you might hear it through, and depending on the valve, for example, mitral stenosis, why you might hear it so, well, stenosis rather than regurgitation, whereas you might hear regurgitation from the mitral valve in the form of ill systolic, and we can go into more detail as to why that might be, but that will involve some knowledge on the cardiac cycle, so just a bit of forewarning there. I think it's time for a bit of coffee. Okay, so just so you know, Geeky Medics do a really good overview of heart murmurs, but there are plenty of other resources which go into better depth. Geeky Medics do a great overview, they always do great overviews. I highly recommend geekymedics.com, but things like cvphysiology.com or Ambos as well, even QuesMed, just to get some further quizzing on this information is better than Geeky Medics for that stuff. So, as an overview, the sound of turbulent blood flow. We might do some bolds here. Turbulent blood flow. I might even give that a bit of pink. Flow through the heart. That's what a murmur is. Okay. And this is obviously abnormal. When you're listening with a stethoscope to the different valve areas of the heart, or if you're just listening to the heart and you hear the beats, it should be boom boom, boom boom, boom boom. It should be sharp, smooth, and outside of those boom boom, boom boom, boom boom noises, it should be silent. Okay? If you hear any kind of whooshing or shushing, it's hard to describe without listening to it yourself. As I said, I've only ever heard a crescendo, decrescendo, and a holosystolic murmur. I mean, I actually was listening to an aortic regurgitation patient yesterday, and it did not sound decrescendo in this way, but I think that's because he had a very, very advanced aortic regurgitation, which actually kind of decreases the sound of the murmur. So again, we can go into that a little bit as to why that will be. What you're listening to with this sort of abnormal sounds, you're hearing turbulent blood flow. Okay, and that makes sense, right? Because essentially, what it is you're listening to is blood. First of all, the boom 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 noises you're hearing. That's the first. That's the first heart sound, and you're hearing valves closing. Okay, that is what you're listening to. You're listening to valves of the heart, boom, snapping shut under the force of pressure from the other side of the valve, closing the valve back against the heart, and it boom, creates a boom. Yeah, okay, that's what we interpret as a normal heart sound. The murmurs, however, and as the name kind of suggests, it's like a murmur. It's not a proper heart sound in like the snapping shut of a valve. It's this sound of turbulent blood flow crashing against valve to the rest of the body. So when that starts to close under a reduced pressure inside of the heart, it regurgitates. So it kind of opens up a bit more, and that could be due to a load of different reasons, right? But you'll hear that because usually the blood will crash against that valve, creating the sound, and then that's it. But if it opens up a bit, blood starts to kind of regurgitate through a little bit. Okay, it starts to regurgitate through, which creates a small murmur, and that's what we interpret, and that is what murmurs are. It is just abnormalities in the heart valve that prevent this kind of strong, smooth, and silent progression of the two heart sounds. And they can be interpreted in many different ways, but that is what it is. What are some of the causes? So, as we said, we have blood flowing through an abnormal narrowing. So that could be stenosis, mitral stenosis, pulmonary stenosis, basically just stenosis, which is you have a vessel, and then a stenosis is some kind of abnormal narrowing. It can be due to a million different reasons, but it's basically the inner side of the lining of that vessel becomes smaller and smaller. Okay, and obviously that's not good, right? And in the case of valves, that is the leaflets of the valve, the actual valvular part of the valve, they become stenosed. Okay, blood flowing in the wrong direction. So this is things like regurgitation. Okay, so it causes a mix of blood flowing from a normal direction against the incorrect direction. An abnormal connection. Now, we didn't talk about this. So the two parts of the heart are connected that shouldn't be. So you have atrial septal defect, a patent ductus arteriosus. Now these are congenital defects. Okay, and blood flowing across these abnormal connections may cause, first of all, the blood to mix, which shouldn't be mixing, or too much blood entering a particular chamber of the heart. So if you have one that connects the atria of the septal defect, these will overfill because it's not used to having blood coming from a particular source as well. And then finally we have blood flowing faster through the heart. So this could be in things like sepsis or thyrotoxicosis. Okay, but we won't go into too much detail because that is nowhere near as important as these two. Just as the abnormal connection is not as common or not necessarily noticeable, but certainly you won't come across it anywhere near as much as blood being regurgitated or the valves being stenosed. Okay, and then we have transmitted heart murmurs. So the turbulent blood flow created by a structural defect in the heart does not stenosis in the valves of either the aortic, or the aortic and the pulmonary, which allow the blood in the arteries to move away from the heart, we hear a systolic murmur, obviously, because it occurs within the systole part of the cardiac cycle. But you'll actually hear it in the later stages of systole, if you see what I mean, because the contraction happens, and then you have isovolumetric, what do they call it, pressure, where the volume doesn't change because the ventricles are contracting, but for a small amount of time during systole, the blood is not being injected through the valves just yet. Then the pressure becomes high enough over time, and they open, and then you hear the murmur. You hear it during that part of systole, during the second half, or end diastolic or mid to end diastolic murmurs. Okay, just keep that in mind. Aortic and pulmonary valves open and they blah 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 blah, just said that. And then the mitral and tricuspid valves shut, so the ones that are going into the atria that feed those ventricles. And this prevents backflow, that's really important. Let's give that a bold into the atria of the contracting ventricles. Pathological backflow back into the atria is known as regurgitation. Although, good to know that you can also have regurgitation into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Although that might be said here because that's not a systolic thing to know. But that backflow is known as regurgitation, okay? Hence the name. Through the mitral or tricuspid valves, and also causes a systolic murmur. Okay, so it starts to make sense where we place different murmurs in the cardiac cycle. When you think about it like that, if you time it like that, so a systolic murmur or an end diastolic murmur, the end of systolic murmur, will happen in like aortic or pulmonary stenosis, okay, and then you'll have regurgitation, which will also cause a systolic murmur, okay, in the mitral or tricuspid valve, those types of regurgitation, okay. But if we look here, you'll see that there is a clear difference between the crescendo, decrescendo, and the holosystolic types of murmurs, the actual sound that you get from the murmur. And if you're very keen-eyed, you'll see that the aortic stenosis and pulmonary stenosis are both crescendo, decrescendo, whereas the regurgitations are both holosystolic. So why might that be? Well, if you think about it in terms of the cardiac cycle, it makes complete sense, and this is the way, personally, I like to learn. I like to understand why it is we hear what we hear, or that the way one thing is. I like to understand the reasons and the theory behind it. Otherwise, you're just remembering things kind of rote, which for me never works and will not stick in my memory. Some things you do need to learn rote, but this is something that I think is better off known through theory and through the actual understanding of the physiology of what we're learning. So if we think about aortic and pulmonary stenosis, like I said, they are end diastolic murmurs. They happen at the end of diastole or mid to end diastole, because we start off with isovolumetric change, and the pressure through the contraction of the ventricles, increasing the pressure within inside. And this is, so systole begins, so we are now within systole, the ventricles begin to contract, but 7 minutes past 8. So I've been recording for about half an hour, so we'll go through diastole now. I mean, this is very similar to what I was just saying. The reason I went into so much detail here is just to give you an idea of the positionings and types of murmurs that you will get in relation to the cardiac cycle. That's so important in my opinion. Just realised I put a little backspace there, a little dash there. Diastole is the same thing, of course. All murmurs are just the same thing. It's very different types of murmurs that you get at very different points of the cardiac cycle. Obviously this is within diastole, not systole, but you can probably get an idea of what I mean now by this stuff, okay? So, in diastole, the ventricles and atria, they relax, so there's no more contraction, so all of the muscle of the heart just relaxes, and the start of diastole begins, and that's what we term early diastole. The aortic and pulmonary valves close, so we get that snapping shut because of the pressure difference as the ejection stops, and this prevents backflow from the aorta back into the ventricle. Otherwise that would be regurgitation. Abnormal backflow through these will give you, so that is aortic or pulmonary regurgitation, will give you an early diastolic murmur. Makes sense, doesn't it? That is blood flowing back through those valves, and you get this decrescendo murmur in these cases. So you see that you have this aortic and pulmonary regurgitation. That's a decrescendo. I wish I had a good reason as to why you get that type of waveform, because that's a very distinctive one. I haven't heard it myself. I've not had it explained to me. I'm trying to think of a reasonable reason as to why you would get such a strange waveform, but I'm not gonna guess and then give you some false information. So I would just recommend you look that up if you're particularly interested, or you can just remember it. So aortic and pulmonary valves are closed, that prevents the backflow. That's early diastolic murmur. Then the atria. Now the atria, all the valves. Those valves, the atria contract towards the end of diastole. Okay, so towards the end of diastole, the atria contract, and this, we've already moved through the cardiac cycle, so the atrial to the atrioventricular valves, the mitral and tricuspid valves, I have already opened a while ago by this point. Okay, and they have been allowing the passive flow of blood from the atria into the ventricles, right? But then the atria contract. Okay, the atria contract, and that finishes off the filling of the ventricles. And as I've said, that's which is mostly passive in nature. This contraction occurs in the mid or late diastole. This is towards the end. Okay, so any kind of mitral or tricuspid issues that you have, so that might be mitral stenosis or tricuspid stenosis, you'll hear those valvular type murmurs, those stenotic type murmurs at the mid or late side of diastole. They would be mid, late or end diastolic murmurs. Okay, through the narrowing of these mitral or tricuspid valves. Makes sense, doesn't it? And these ones you get a decrescendo crescendo type waveform. Again, I don't know why. It seems strange to me. It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. There's probably a very good and very understandable reason, but I just don't know it. So, sorry. I've said many times before, this is as much a revision session for me as it is a teaching session for you, so I do apologise if I don't have the answers sometimes. So let's quickly go through the normal heart sounds. So we alluded to S1 and S2 very, very briefly. There are, technically speaking, the potential for 4 heart sounds, some of which are potentially pathological, but the first and the second heart sounds are the ones that we're really important, are really interested in. Don't know if you heard that train just then. But yeah, it can be helpful or useful to view so we have this stenosis started distally, peripheral pulse will be felt at the same time or just after S1 due to a little bit of a lag phase. Then we have S2, the second heart sound. This is the closure of the aortic and pulmonary valves, denotes the end of systole and the start of diastole. The pulmonary valve may close just after the aortic valve. Okay. The delay is due to I'm saying the delay is due to closing and inspiration. It can be, I think it can just be normal, but it's kind of exacerbated if it closes on inspiration due to pressure differences in the thorax. Defects can cause more blood to be pumped from the right ventricle on inspiration, just like expiration can exacerbate these sounds on the other side of the heart. So S2 is not always one discrete sound, it can be kind of split in this way, and this splitting is definitely exacerbated by inspiration. And these are all the different murmurs that you can get in relation to the timings of the different heart sounds and the different phases of the cardiac cycle. And it's pretty much the same as... Did we have another little one, another overview or something? Or maybe we didn't. I could have sworn we did. Am I going mad? Perhaps not. But yeah, we can time it quite nicely now, and it makes a lot more sense. I guess we had this kind of thing, didn't we? Maybe that's what I'm thinking about. That's my short-term memory example to you guys. So yeah, we can time it now. So as you can see, we have a certain murmur starting at the certain end points or start points of different parts of the cardiac cycle, and we have different heart sounds that we can kind of locate ourselves with the same thing. And this is why when you're listening to murmurs, you will be listening over certain valve areas of the heart. Whilst you have your fingers palpating maybe the radial pulse, or probably more often than not the carotid pulse in the neck, to time yourself with the heart sounds and the pulse. So am I in systole, diastole, and then you can time when you're hearing the murmur at the same time. And you can think, well, it happens then, it's probably this type of a murmur or this type of a murmur. Very useful. It makes it much easier to position yourself in the cardiac cycle of your patient. Okay, so I think we'll just do a little bit more. We have what I think are the four most important, or five really. These five, rather that is also important, but these four are the most important valvular pathologies that we should go through. But probably not going to go into them today. I've also left out things like pulmonary stenosis and pulmonary regurgitation, and not done anything on tricuspid, tricuspid regurgitation and stenosis are also quite important to know. So, but these are not directly important on a murmur. Actually going into the pathology of each of these, for example, all the clinical features and causes of aortic stenosis is not vital to know in a purely murmur lecture, if you want to call it a lecture. So let's go through some of the huge amounts to know when identifying the cause of a murmur. So, good time to have a drink of coffee, I think. So, identifying the cause of a murmur, right? So, first of all, just relaxed, and so the aortic and pulmonary valves have closed in early diastole, and therefore we get a little bit of regurgitation. It happens right at the start of diastole. I'm seeing where they've put this. Oh yeah, they have. They put it here. Yep, that makes sense. And then we have mid to late diastole, mitral and tricuspid stenosis. Makes sense. We've already talked about that. So, what are the characteristics of a murmur? So we have the crescendo, decrescendo, and the holosystolic. We've already talked about that. Then we have other causes of ejection, systolic murmurs, which are ones that occur when blood is being ejected through those arterial valves, the aortic and pulmonary valves, after isovolumetric contraction. Okay, so when blood is actually being ejected through, so rapid ejection, that's when you hear these murmurs, and these are more specific. Interesting to know. I'm not going to read through this. Have a look into it if you want to know, but we've got things like hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, okay, and aortic sclerosis, atrial septal defects. Okay, this is when we get different types of murmurs. More specific, less likely to hear them if you're starting out in medicine. I've never heard any of these types of things. You need to have a bit of experience, I think. I don't think it's too relatable to this session. Is the murmur heard the loudest in the bell or diaphragm? And this is mostly to do with high-pitched or low-pitched types of murmurs. So, for example, a high-pitched murmur will be heard in the diaphragm, whereas a low-pitched murmur, so like something that you might hear through mitral regurgitation, is better heard using the other side, the smaller side, the bell of the stethoscope. Where is it heard loudest? Okay, so now we're going into the valvular areas, and I think it's probably good to just spend maybe a few minutes on this. You might know this stuff already. I believe there's a good mnemonic for this. So the letters are A, P, T, M, and I think, oh yeah, okay, so yes, I remember it now. All patients trust me. That's the way to remember it. It might not be true. Certainly isn't true with me. But it's a good way to remember it nonetheless. So what this basically means is that bold. I think it is bold. So all patients trust me, aortic, pulmonary, tricuspid and mitral. And it just helps you to remember the positioning. So all patients trust me, aortic, pulmonary, mitral, tricuspid, the aortic valve. Now it might seem odd, but you need to remember that the heart is kind of twisted and angled forward. So you might think, well, the aortic and mitral valve will be on the left side of the patient when you're listening to the chest, and the pulmonary and tricuspid valves are on the right hand side of the patient when I'm listening. Not quite. Tricuspid and mitral, yes, but the pulmonary and aortic, when you're listening, are switched over because there is a twist to the heart and an angulation to the heart. And also you need to remember that the aortic valve is technically extra. It's kind of outside of the heart just slightly. It's within the aorta. It's within that, I've forgotten what you call it. This little cleft within the heart, and it sits within that little area. It's like the aortic sinus, it sits within it, within this ring at the start of the aorta. And the aorta is a massive artery, and it twists, and it's kind of tortuous in nature, really. So it kind of wraps around. As you can see, the aorta is like that. And we hear it best on the other side to the pulmonary. The pulmonary is on the right side of the patient, or left side if you're left side of the patient, right side if you're looking at the patient, and the aortic valve is best on the other side. And the way I remember it is literally 2, 2, 4, 5. So the aortic area is the second intercostal space. Okay, on the right sternal edge, or right parasternal, so right parasternal. And then the way to remember mitral, you can just remember 2, 2, 4, 5, but it's in the mid-clavicular line, so this is the clavicle, think mid-clavicular, 5th intercostal space. But a lot of us, if you're in medicine or if you're in nursing or whatever, you will already know the 5th intercostal space, left mid-clavicular line, is the cardiac apex, the very end, the very sharp point at the left ventricle, the end of the left ventricle of the heart, which is known as the cardiac apex, which is the best place to auscultate the heart. Just generally is the best place to hear the heartbeat, because the heart is angled forward, right? So you hear the apex really well in the 5th intercostal space, left mid-clavicular line. Okay, so that's the mitral valve. Right, that probably makes sense. That's the valve that's closest to the apex beat. Mitral area, 5th intercostal space. Tricuspid area, 4th intercostal space, left sternal edge. Pulmonary area, the 2nd intercostal space at the left sternal edge, and the aorta is the same intercostal space, the 2nd intercostal space on the right sternal edge. Boom. Makes complete sense, right? Aorta, pulmonary. This is the mitral valve, but you hear it down here, and then the tricuspid valve is here. Makes sense. And as you can see, the aortic valve is actually more right-sided than the pulmonary valve because of the aorta wrapping around like that and the angulation of the heart. So it makes sense. I hope you understand that. Okay. So then we have some manoeuvres. There's 2 main manoeuvres. This one, the mitral valve, is good to know, but this is the main one, the aortic valve. Just to, if you think you're hearing a murmur, what manoeuvre can I get the patient to do to exacerbate that murmur? Just the loudness of it, and basically what you're doing at the end of the day is how can I bring that valve that I think has a murmur closer to the chest wall, so that when I auscultate it with my stethoscope, it's closer to my stethoscope and I can hear it more clearly. So, in terms of an aortic valve, so you're thinking like an aortic murmur, whether that be a regurgitation or a stenosis. Okay. So in terms of the aortic valve, sitting them forwards, so you get the patient to sit up in the bed or whatever, and sit them forwards, this brings the aortic valve, okay, so the one that's on the 2nd intercostal space on the right side, on the right parasternal, that brings it close to the chest wall, and you'll hear all aortic murmurs a lot louder that position. The mitral valve, we have this, it's called the left lateral decubitus position. Okay, I've never heard it actually called this, but apparently that's what it was called online. And it's basically just getting to roll over onto their left side, and it brings the apex close to the chest wall, and so you hear mitral valves louder. Okay, just good to remember. And then do we hear it louder on inspiration or expiration? We already talked about this. This is to do with the increases or decreases in intrathoracic pressures within the thorax. Okay, so for example, if it reduces on inspiration, the intrathoracic pressure will reduce. And we'll get more blood flow through certain chambers of the heart. You get certain valve lesions becoming louder, and we get certain murmurs becoming louder. So have a read through this at your leisure. It is important to know. I'm just not going to spend too much time on it because we've already kind of talked about it, and it's explained quite nicely here. Does the murmur radiate? We already talked about this briefly. So for example, aortic stenosis radiating to the carotid in the neck, and we also talked about mitral regurgitation radiating to the axilla. But we also have other small radiations. These are the main ones. Okay, these are the main ones you want to be aware of. Pulmonary stenosis does radiate to the left shoulder or infraclavicular region as well. I've also got a few other abnormalities you might experience on a peripheral examination, which can give you important features of cardiac pathologies. So, reading off his pulse, you need to be looking at the character and pressure, also the volume, if it's placed slightly to the left, that could be a sign of hypertrophy of the heart. Okay, but we do loads of things like echocardiography, which are much better at identifying things like hypertrophy and really valve disorders in general as well. Then you have JVP abnormalities. That's the jugular venous pressure, which is the JVP can be identified in the neck near to where the carotid is, and this can be a sign of loads of types of cardiac abnormalities. Basically, right heart failure can create huge backups in the pulmonary blood circulation, which eventually leads to the increase in blood pressure in the JVP, which will increase it. You can see in someone's neck quite pronounced. You need to know how to measure the JVP as well, which is not related to here though. I mean, it is related, but it's not something we need to go through. And then there's signs of general heart failure. So quite importantly is edema. So sacral edema at the bottom of the back can become, you can do pissing edema where you push your finger in it. If it stays, you know that someone's kind of edematous. But also at the ends of people's feet, so peel edema around the ankles, around the tops of the feet. It can be quite swollen if someone has heart failure. Again, for the same reasons as JVP, really, because of just congestion of the of blood, really. So that is everything we're going to go through. We have all of these to look at, but we're not going to go through these in this video. That is everything that I want to talk to you guys about regarding murmurs for now. I know in the last video I talked about we went through ECGs, and I plan on finishing that off very, very soon. So if we have a look here, you see all the things I'm yet to fill in. I've completed that, and we can go into the second part very, very soon, looking at QRS, ST segments, T waves, U waves, and then I've got a number of questions I want to go through with you guys. I've got one here, but there are a number of questions that I found online that I thought would be fun to look through with you. So we'll do that in the next video, I think. Finish off that little mini-series on ECGs, and then it's up to you guys if you want to suggest something. I've had a couple of suggestions from people who are in the $5 tier of my Patreon. If you're still here listening to the video, this can be a little bit of a spiel just on Patreon. We had originally decided that those in the $5 tier would be eligible, I guess, to watch a kind of live lecture type discussion things with you guys. I still really want to do that, but there's currently only 2 people in that tier, so I thought a session might be a bit odd just to do with 2 people and myself. I'd like to be more kind of a lecture format. So I thought what might be better, and actually probably better value for you guys, is if you're in that tier, you can just suggest me a video. I've already been suggested one. I'm looking forward to getting into. It's quite an interesting topic as well. But if you guys do like the idea of having live sessions on like Microsoft Teams or Zoom, then head over to Patreon and take a look at that second tier, the $5 tier, and yeah, we can think about that. There's also a number of other ways that you guys can get involved in the channel over there. So again, yeah, if you want access to these notes, I have loads of notes, not just these ones from different years. I have what I will be doing is putting up all of my past questions as well, and these are very, very good to know. These are from my university, so I'll be writing these up and putting them online for you guys. Not sure if I'm allowed to do that, but yeah, I think that would be useful for you guys as well. Maybe we can even do an online quiz together. That would be fun. So, but guys, we can leave it there. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all very, very soon.